Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, June 26, 2023. A federal judge puts on hold the plea deal in Hunter Biden's criminal case of failure to pay income tax and illegally possessing a firearm as a drug user, as the judge raises concerns about terms of the agreement, specifically language of not prosecuting Hunter Biden in the future, after federal prosecutors confirmed that the president's son is still under federal investigation. Hunter Biden then pleaded not guilty to the charges. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell announces another interest rate increase, 0.25%. It's the 11th rate hike in 17 months, designed to bring down high inflation. We'll hear from the Fed chair and talk with MarketWatch economics reporter Jeffrey Bartash. U.S. House starts on the first of the 12 annual government spending bills. This one covering Veterans Affairs and military construction, with sharp disagreements over controversial amendments on issues such as abortion and promoting diversity. Bipartisan agreement at a House subcommittee hearing on sightings of UFOs and unidentified aerial phenomena, UAPs. Agreement that the federal government should release more information. One of the witnesses, a former Air Force intelligence officer, says the U.S. government has for decades been holding secret, non-human intelligence. And the Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas testifies before a House Committee on Immigration and Border Security as some Republicans make it clear they want to impeach him over his handling of the U.S.-Mexico border. The story from CBS News, a plea agreement between federal prosecutors and Hunter Biden fell apart Wednesday after the judge refused to sign off on a deal that would have seen the president's son enter guilty pleas in 2 misdemeanor tax charges and enter a diversion program in lieu of pleading guilty to a felony gun possession count. After the deal collapsed, Hunter Biden entered a not guilty plea. The judge deferred the decision on the plea deal, saying, "You are telling me to rubber stamp the agreement." The parties have 14 days to brief her, and the ruling could now be delayed 4 weeks. That from CBS News. The judge said she was concerned about language in the diversion agreement, which contained details about not prosecuting Hunter Biden for tax crimes in the future. This since the prosecutor said Hunter Biden remains under investigation. Well, that was all happening in the courtroom in Wilmington, Delaware. At the White House in Washington, D.C., Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre began her news conference with this statement.
Now, I know many people have been following the news in Delaware today and we're going to have a lot of questions. And so here's what I'll say at the top before I turn it over to my colleague, the Admiral. Hunter Biden is a private citizen, and this was a personal matter for him. As we have said, the President, the First Lady, they love their son, and they support him as he continues to rebuild his life. This case was handled independently, as all of you know, by the Justice Department under the leadership of a prosecutor appointed by the former president, President Trump. So for anything further, as you know, and we've been very consistent from here, I'd refer you to the Department of Justice and to Hunter's representatives, who is his legal team, obviously, who can address any of your questions.
The White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre opening today's news conference. And the first question from a reporter was on this subject.
Have you seen the president since Hunter Biden showed up in federal court, since the deal fell apart? Did he have any reaction that he has agreed to allow you to share with us?
So I'll tell you this, and I'll repeat this as what I said at the top, which is the president loves his son. The president and the First Lady love their son, and they support him as he's rebuilding his life and trying to move forward. I have not spoken to the president today. He has been busy continuing to work on behalf of the American people, as he does every day with internal meetings, and so I will leave it there.
White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre with reporters in the White House briefing room. Senator Marsha Blackburn, Republican from Tennessee, tweeted when it looked like the Hunter Biden plea deal was going to be accepted, "We all know if Hunter didn't have the last name Biden, he wouldn't be getting a sweetheart deal, 2 tiers of justice." Then, when the deal was rejected for now, Senator Blackburn joining Fox News host Sarah Carter with a video.
Well, it's a typical day in D.C. You never know what is going to happen on a typical day in D.C. And Sarah has popped by the office, and we're just watching all of this happening with Hunter Biden and the supposed plea deal.
Oh, it's extraordinary. So you're right. It is a typical day in D.C. So not only was there a hearing on UFOs, but apparently Hunter Biden right now, the plea deal has been thrown out the window by the judge. And this is extraordinary because I think that everybody knew, he was going to be charged and there was no way to walk away from the tax fraud. But all of a sudden to find out that there's possibly a much bigger investigation going on Hunter Biden and what that is. Yes. That's pretty interesting to me. What do you think is going to happen, Senator, at this point? I mean, if they throw the plea deal out, what happens next?
Well, if they throw the plea deal out, then they will have to reposition and decide if they're going to go to trial or how they're going to proceed. So, if I were you, go home tonight, get yourself a big old bowl of popcorn and a big old glass of iced tea.
Iced tea or red wine, if you choose. This may be a long night.
It's going to be a long night.
Senator Marsha Blackburn, Republican from Tennessee, and Sarah Carter of Fox News in a video tweet. This morning, reporters caught up with Congressman James Comer, Republican from Kentucky, chair of the Oversight and Accountability Committee. Comer tweeting, "Today, District Judge Noriega did the right thing by refusing to rubber stamp Hunter Biden's sweetheart plea deal, but let's be clear, Hunter's sweetheart plea deal belongs in the trash. The DOJ must be held accountable for its Biden family cover-up." And they asked James Comer about that deal, when it looked like it was going through.
Hunter Biden plans to plead guilty today to 2 misdemeanor tax crimes and a diversion program for a gun crime. I mean, do you think, after everything you found out, what do you think would be the next step? And if he does plead guilty, does that hurt y'all's investigation going forward?
No, I'm investigating Joe Biden. We've always investigated Joe Biden. I know the media calls it the Hunter Biden investigation, but it's the Joe Biden investigation. And I think you heard that from the Irish whistleblowers. They said that they were getting closer and closer to Joe Biden. They wanted to interview Biden family members. And that's when the DOJ said, well, where's this going to end up? And they said, well, it could end up with Joe Biden because of the text messages and the emails and the evidence that was in the laptop. Somebody set all these deals up, and no one that has any type of rational thinking would think that it was Hunter Biden. And we have talked to people that had sources that have told us that Joe Biden was directly involved in many of these deals. So we want to bring in the people that were involved. You have Archer was involved with the Burisma deal. You have people like Bobolinsky that was involved with the Chinese deals. You've got Eric Sherwin that was involved in some of the deals. So every one of these major transactions from foreign nationals had a different person that was involved with the Biden. Rob Walker with some of the Chinese deals. So these are the people that we want to bring in.
Congressman James Comer, Republican from Kentucky, chair of the Oversight Committee, with reporters in D.C. outside the House office buildings right across the street from the Capitol building. Questions as well to the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, at a news conference inside the Capitol.
Leader Schumer, are you at all worried
so you reposition yourself?
I did. Are you at all worried that Hunter Biden and the controversies and the cases around Hunter Biden are going to be a liability for President Biden in his re-election in 2024?
The bottom line is this is a prosecution being done in a fair way by a former Trump prosecutor, and I have faith in the results.
Yes. Thank you, Leader Schumer. What was your reaction to the Hunter Biden plea deal falling apart?
Again, I think I have faith in the prosecution, and it was a Trump prosecutor who was appointed, and no one should interfere with this politically, ideologically, and let justice go forward.
The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer at a news conference with other Senate Democratic leaders. A note about the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky. The Washington Post writes that Senator McConnell on Wednesday abruptly left a news conference after he froze midway through his opening remarks and appeared to be unable to resume speaking immediately. He was led back to his office by another Senate Republican leader and returned after several minutes, and then when asked by a reporter about it, said, "I'm fine." Senator McConnell is 81 years old. 4 months ago, he fell and suffered a concussion and broken rib. This is Washington Today. And now to the economy. This from CNBC. The Federal Reserve on Wednesday approved a much-anticipated interest rate hike that takes benchmark borrowing costs to their highest level in more than 22 years. In a move that financial markets had completely priced in, the central bank's Federal Open Market Committee raised its funds rate by a quarter percentage point to a target range of 5.25% to 5.5%. The midpoint of that target range would be the highest level for the benchmark rate since early 2001. That was from CNBC. The Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell made this announcement at his news conference.
We understand the hardship that high inflation is causing, and we remain strongly committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2% goal. Price stability is the responsibility of the Federal Reserve. Without price stability, the economy doesn't work for anyone. In particular, without price stability, we will not achieve a sustained period of strong labor market conditions that benefit all. Since early last year, the FOMC has significantly tightened the stance of monetary policy. Today, we took another step by raising our policy interest rate a quarter percentage point, and we are continuing to reduce our securities holdings at a brisk pace. We've covered a lot of ground, and the full effects of our tightening have yet to be felt. Looking ahead, we will continue to take a data-dependent approach in determining the extent of additional policy firming that may be appropriate.
Jeffrey Bartash, economics reporter with MarketWatch, has been covering the Federal Reserve's latest interest rate hike and joins us now. Thank you so much. This was expected, right?
Totally expected. The Fed raised interest rates to a top end of 5.5%. That's the highest rate in 22 years. And obviously the Fed's trying to slow inflation, and that does tend to slow the economy, but so far it's not really doing that. The economy's still doing pretty darn well.
What did the Federal Reserve Chair say about future rate hikes?
The Fed didn't want to commit itself one way or the other. They're going to look at all the information on inflation and employment and wages, and they'll make a decision, and they'll meet again in 2 months, and they'll make a decision then. The Fed chairman did not want to get pinned down, and he didn't want to say one way or the other. He just wants to keep all his options open.
Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell said during his news conference, we remain committed to bringing inflation back to our 2% goal. No one should doubt that. Has anyone been doubting that?
There's always lots of doubters about the Fed, but Wall Street seems convinced, finally, and it's taken investors quite some time, that the Fed is determined to get inflation out 2%. They'll do whatever's needed to get to that point. The big worry historically is that when the Fed starts raising rates, it usually causes a recession. But the Fed's feeling pretty optimistic right now. They think they can get inflation down to where it used to be and keep the U.S. economy growing. It's a difficult thing to pull off, and seldom have achieved that in their history, but they feel pretty good about it.
At MarketWatch.com, you write, maybe it's splitting hairs, but the Fed says the economy is growing at a moderate pace now. In June, it used the word modest. And then you write, moderate in Fed lingo is slightly better than modest. Can you explain that a little bit more?
The economy is not slowed as much as the Fed thought. Usually when you raise interest rates, borrowing costs go up. People stop buying houses. They stop buying cars. Companies don't invest as much. They don't hire as much. We're not seeing the usual effects of interest rates. We're not seeing all these negative effects in the economy. We're seeing the housing, but not too many other places. So the Fed naturally has been surprised by this, and when they look at the economy right now, they think it's resilient enough that it's going to keep growing even in the face of higher interest rates. This is uncommon. It doesn't happen often. It's obviously a great thing for Americans, but again, the question is, can the Fed pull off? Because historically, it's a hard thing to do.
We're talking with Jeffrey Bartash from MarketWatch. What was the vote on today's decision to raise interest rates, and does that go along with what's been happening in the past? Has there been dissent, or they've been unanimous?
The Fed vote today was unanimous. All 11 members voted in favor of a rate increase. Historically, there are very few dissents in the Fed. There is actually quite a bit of disagreement within board members on what to do about the economy, but typically people don't dissent unless they feel super strongly about something, because typically a dissent doesn't really make any difference in the end. So you're not going to see people in the Fed get in broad, open disagreements. If they have disagreements, it'll all happen behind closed doors.
And during today's news conference with Fed Chair Jerome Powell, was there any question or his answer that sort of struck you as something different?
Fed Chairman Powell sometimes mixes messages, but today he seemed to be, like so many people in Washington, on point. He didn't deviate from his message, and his message was clear. The Fed is not done getting interest rates, is not necessarily done raising interest rates, and they're determined to squelch inflation. And he didn't want to give any room for doubt. Typically, as I said, he often sometimes gives mixed messages. Today, he stayed on message, and he seemed to get a little irritated with reporters who try to get him to commit one way or the other.
Jeffrey Bartash is an economics reporter with MarketWatch. You can find his work at MarketWatch.com and on Twitter at jbartash. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
And Wall Street reaction today, the Dow up 82, NASDAQ down 17, S&P down a fraction. And at CNBC, the headline, Dow rises for a 13th straight day, posting its best winning streak since 1987. President Biden announced today he'll be nominating former Maryland Governor Martin O'Malley to lead the Social Security Administration. Martin O'Malley also ran for the Democratic nomination for president in 2016. Story from the Washington Examiner, the House managed to advance the rule on its annual military construction appropriations bill on Wednesday, despite initial threats from hardline conservatives to tank the legislation unless it met their list of demands. The Military Construction, Veteran Affairs, and Related Agencies Appropriations Act narrowly passed the House with a 217 to 206 vote, advancing largely along party lines to be considered on the floor for a full vote later in the evening. Despite traditionally receiving bipartisan support, the legislation advanced with no Democratic support due to a slew of controversial amendments proposed by Republican members. Only 2 Republicans voted against the measure, Victoria Spartz of Illinois and John Rose of Tennessee. That reporting from Washington Examiner. Here's a bit of the floor debate before that vote. Congressman Nick Langworthy, Republican from New York, supporting the bill.
I rise today in support of keeping the promises made to our nation's veterans. Millions of men and women have served this nation in uniform, bravely, and they've been failed by the Department of Veterans Affairs. Too often, the VA has left veterans and their loved ones with long delays, substandard service, and neglect. And now, rather than continue the Trump administration's work to hold the VA accountable, the Biden administration is instead focused on promoting divisive ideologies and radical leftist priorities. Mr. Speaker, the VA should be focused on the needs of our nation's veterans, not promoting a political agenda. The legislation before us today puts the VA back on the task at hand, caring for the men and women who gave it their all for this country. Like finally pushing the VA to fix its electronic health record system, where patient safety issues have been so dire that they've even resulted in several deaths. Now, let me say that again. The inability for the VA to do its job has resulted in injury and death to veterans. Sadly, this isn't the first time we've heard such negligence. We need to do better. We owe it better, and this bill will help accomplish this today. And I think I speak today for all the veterans in my district when I say that they're sick and tired of indignities and substandard care due to electronic records. I strongly support the underlying legislation before us today, and I hope my colleagues can overcome partisan outrage to stand with our nation's veterans.
Congressman Nick Langworthy, Republican from New York, on the House floor before a vote on the rule which governs floor debate on that VA and military construction spending bill. A CQ roll call summary of the bill reads, the bill provides a total of $155.7 billion in net discretionary spending for military construction, Veterans Affairs Department medical care and other activities, as well as $161.7 billion in mandatory funding for VA pensions and other benefits. The discretionary total is $1.5 billion, or 1% more than fiscal year 2023, and includes $17.5 billion for military construction. That's 8% less than 2023, and $137.8 billion for the VA. That's 2% more. And then it fully funds the president's request for veterans' medical care. This again from CQ Roll Call. The measure represents the first fiscal year 2024 spending bill to come to the House floor. Democrats are opposing all 12 measures because the GOP drafted bills are set at discretionary caps $119 billion below the caps set by the recent debt limit agreement, and because they include controversial conservative policy riders. Returning to the House floor debate, here's Congressman James Clyburn, Democrat from South Carolina.
This ill-conceived legislation, in addition to reducing funds for the military construction projects that are fundamental to our service members' quality of life is also an attack on the dignity of our veterans. It attacks the dignity of women veterans by blocking reproductive health care when their health is endangered. It attacks the dignity of veterans in need to gender reaffirming care by blocking the VA from providing it even if it is recommended by a doctor. It attacks the dignity of veterans and all Americans of color and others who have been historically underserved, marginalized, and adversely affected by persistent poverty and inequality by blocking the Biden administration's ongoing efforts to advance equity. President Truman recognized that our national security is enhanced by respecting the dignity of all American patriots who sacrifice to defend it. This legislation being brought today by the extreme Republican majority is at odds with that principle.
Congressman James Clyburn, Democrat from South Carolina, today on the House floor before the House voted to start debate on this spending bill for Veterans Affairs and Military Construction for fiscal year 2024. Congressman Clyburn talking about today's 75th anniversary of President Harry Truman's executive orders that desegregated the U.S. Armed Forces and U.S. government workforce. The Pentagon held a ceremony today about that anniversary. One of the speakers, Terry Dickerson, director of the Civil Rights Staff of the Coast Guard.
I'd be remiss if I didn't mention my father, a member of the Army's 92nd Buffalo Infantry Division during World War II. He was among what was then called colored troops who fought overseas for freedoms that he could not experience in the United States. As much as other military members, African Americans served with honor, valor, and courage. In all black units, some represented here, but their accomplishments often went unnoted, and they still could not eat, use restrooms, shop, or even worship freely in the American South. President Truman signed the desegregation orders, but think about this. It took African American members going into spaces and jobs and situations that they had previously been barred from to make desegregation a reality. We must not forget that what they did brought in a new era of equality to the government, military, and the nation. My father didn't talk a lot about his experience, but he left a memoir, and I can tell you, he would never believe that this time with these leaders gathered in this iconic setting in this courtyard on these grounds would his service and that of other colored units be noted. He died without knowing that their achievements would be recognized and valued, many of them posthumously. A lot of people think that segregation occurred all at once, but it didn't. It unfolded sector by sector. Military and federal government desegregation was a historic turning point that actually inspired other institutions to desegregate.
Terry Dickerson is director of the Civil Rights Staff of the Coast Guard, one of the speakers at today's Pentagon ceremony on the 75th anniversary of President Truman's executive orders directing the military and federal workforce to ensure, quote, the equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. Washington Today continues in a moment.
When citizens are truly informed, our republic thrives. Get informed straight from the source on C-SPAN. Unfiltered, unbiased, word for word. From the nation's capital to wherever you are. Because the opinion that matters the most is your own. This is what democracy looks like. C-SPAN, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast wherever you find your podcasts and on the C-SPAN Now mobile app. Story from the Washington Times, objects that can maintain Mach 1 speeds even in the face of gale force winds. Aircraft with no visible means of lift or propulsion and no wings or engines. Phenomena that seem to operate outside of the known aerodynamic principles that we expect for objects that fly in our atmosphere. Those are some of the descriptions that former U.S. military personnel used when recounting their personal encounters with UFOs, telling lawmakers Wednesday that the unexplained phenomena in American skies are a significant national security threat and that the federal government must share with the public more information about them. That reporting from the Washington Times. One of the witnesses at today's House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee hearing was Ryan Graves, a former F-18 pilot, now executive director of the group Americans for Safe Aerospace. Here he's questioned by Congressman Jamie Raskin, Democrat from Maryland.
My first question is, you've identified these as taking place on the East Coast. Is it just on the East Coast where these encounters have been reported?
No. Since the events initially occurred, I've learned that the objects have been detected essentially where all operations, Navy operations are being conducted across the world. And that's from the All-Domain Anomaly Resolutions Office reporting.
All right, can you describe your experience after you decided to come forward and go public with your experience?
Certainly. Like many others, in 2017, I saw the New York Times article come out as well. And for me, it was special because I recognized the voices on the video. I recognized the video itself. I had seen it when it was taken. I'd seen it when it was debriefed. And so that was kind of shook me because I realized that this problem was still ongoing. And so I reached out to colleagues back on the East Coast and realized that this was still a safety risk that they were dealing with, that they had essentially hit a wall with how they could move forward on this conversation. It was at that point when I decided to try to move the conversation forward myself.
Are there common characteristics to the UAPs that have been cited by different pilots, and can you describe what the convergence of descriptions is?
Certainly. We were primarily seeing dark gray or black cubes inside of a clear sphere.
I'm sorry, dark gray or black cubes?
Yes, inside of a clear sphere, where the apex or tips of the cube were touching the inside of that sphere. And that was primarily what was being reported when we were able to gain a visual tally of these objects. And that occurred over almost 8 years. And as far as I know, it's still occurring.
I take it that you're arguing what we need is real transparency in a reporting system so we can get some clarity on what's going on out there, because there are many pilots in your situation, but we should have a way of developing a systematic inventory of all of such encounters. Is that right?
Yes, and I think we need both transparency and the reporting. We have the reporting, but we need to make sure that information can be promulgated to commercial aviation as well as the rest of the populace.
Ryan Graves, former Navy pilot, questioned by Congressman Jamie Raskin, ranking Democrat on the Oversight and Accountability Committee, at today's subcommittee hearing on UAPs, unidentified aerial or sometimes anomalous phenomena. Another witness, retired Air Force Intelligence Officer David Grush, who was head of a government task force on UAPs, and as Associated Press writes it, testified the U.S. is concealing a long-standing program that retrieves and reverse engineers unidentified flying objects, and also asked whether the U.S. government had information about extraterrestrial life. Grush said the U.S. likely has been aware of non-human activity since the 1930s. Here's David Grush, questioned by Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna, Republican from Florida.
In the last couple of years, have you had incidences that have caused you to be in fear for your life for addressing these issues?
Yes, personally.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just want everyone to note that he's coming forward in fear of his life. To put in perspective, if they were really not scared about this information coming out, why would someone be intimidated like that? To your knowledge, are NHIs working with adversarial foreign governments in either technology exchange programs or back engineering programs?
I don't have data on that. I'm not sure.
Have you heard or you had people come forward to present that evidence?
Not that particular evidence that you just espoused.
Okay, on the 19th of April, Dr. Kirkpatrick, head of Aero, had said that he did not find any evidence of UAPs. You also stated that you had, in your interview, that you had briefed him on information that you were uncovering, but that he did not follow up with you. Were the items that you divulged to him pertinent to national security?
Yes, him and I had a classified conversation in April 2022 before he took over Aero in July 2022, and I provided him some concerns I had.
Do you know why he might not have followed up with you?
Unfortunately, I cannot read his mind. I wish he did. I was happy to give sage counsel to him on where to look when he took the helm of Aero.
Okay, and then my last question for you before I move to Mr. Graves is you received prior approval from the Defense Department to speak on certain issues, correct?
Correct, through DOPSR, DoD Pre-Publication and Security Review, and I just want to remind the public, they're just looking from a security perspective. These are my own personal views and opinions, not the department's.
Okay, I'm asking that though mainly because I think that there are many people that would like to discredit you. So it does bring a certain amount of credibility to your testimony.
I'm required by law to do that as a former intelligence officer, or I go to jail for revealing classified information.
Yeah, we don't want you to go to jail.
Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna, Republican from Florida, with witness David Grush, former Air Force intelligence officer, at today's subcommittee hearing on unidentified aerial phenomena. More from the Associated Press article. The Pentagon has denied David Grush's claims of a cover-up. In a statement, a spokeswoman said investigators have not discovered any verifiable information to substantiate claims that any programs regarding the possession or reverse engineering of extraterrestrial materials have existed in the past or exist currently. This is Washington Today. The Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas testified today before the House Judiciary Committee. Almost all of the questions to him were about immigration and border security. CNN writes that the secretary is facing House Republicans who have been making the case to potentially impeach him over his handling of the U.S.-Mexico border, and that he maintained in his opening remarks that the administration's approach to the border is working, saying unlawful entries between ports of entry along the southwest border have consistently decreased by more than half compared to the peak before the end of Title 42. Here's some of today's hearing, starting with Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz of Florida.
2 million encounters and releases under your watch. So not including the Title 42 expulsions, not including violent criminals. Of those 2 million plus that you've encountered and released, how many have you told to go home?
Congressman, individuals who are released are placed in immigration enforcement proceedings under the law where they can make their claim for relief. If their claim for relief is not satisfied, they are subject to removal from the United States.
Right, subject to removal sounds very different than actually removed. So I'm not interested in the process. I'm not interested in what people are subject to. 2 million people encountered and released. Not the expulsions under Title 42, not the criminals. How many of those people have you deported?
So, Congressman, a few points. Number one.
Just how many of the people? I just want to know how many. It's just a number.
Congressman, we are dealing with a completely broken immigration system.
I get it. No, Mr. Secretary, I'm not going to let you burn my 5 minutes. Do you know the answer? Do you know the number of people out of that 2 million that you've removed that aren't criminals?
I do know that we have removed more aggravated felons.
Right, I'm not asking about them. I've caveated that away, because here's what I'm sort of getting and what your non-responsiveness is demonstrating. The Mayorkas doctrine is this. If you show up at the border and get released into the country, if you don't commit a specific aggravated felony, which, by the way, doesn't include a lot of assault and battery, doesn't include a lot of bad domestic violence, but if you're not one of the people who commit those crimes, you get to stay forever. Is that a fair characterization of your doctrine?
No, that is false.
Then tell me how many you're sending home.
No, that is false.
Okay, well, but you don't know the number of how many you've sent home. Here's another number. 1.2 million people today have been through your entire process, right? They've been through what you call a removal proceeding is just an amnesty dance. Because after the 1.2 million people get an order from the judge saying that they don't have a basis to be here, you still don't remove them. Like, what's your plan to remove those people?
Congressman, that is false.
Okay, how many of them then? Just give me the number.
Congressman, in this country, there are between 11 and 12 million.
Right, but I'm asking about a subset that you won't send home. And the reason you're smirking about it and the reason you won't answer my question is because everybody gets the joke. And the sad thing is it's not just us here, it's the cartels who get the joke too. And so now what you've done to execute this Mayorkas doctrine where so long as you don't commit a crime, you get to stay here and burden our hospitals, burden our schools, burden our social services, burden our jails. You've sent the message to the cartels, and then you've taken this app and you've digitized illegal immigration and you've scaled it to the moon.
Congressman Matt Gaetz, Republican from Florida, questioning the Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas at today's Judiciary Committee hearing. The Committee's ranking Democrat is Gerald Nadler from New York, who used his time to ask questions addressing some of the Republican claims about the secretary that have led to some talk of a possible impeachment.
My Republican colleagues claim that the border is open. Is the border open, Mr. Secretary?
No, it is not.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. The border is not open, and to say so is not only false, but is really an insult to the brave men and women of the Border Patrol who work every day to keep us safe. Next, Mr. Secretary, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have been extremely focused on an exchange you had with Mr. Roy the last time you appeared before this committee. They claim that you lied to the committee about whether we have operational control of the border. The Homeland Security Committee even wrote about it in Phase 1 of their investigation into potential impeachment. It is my understanding that DHS and its components use different definitions of the term operational control. For example, the U.S. Border Patrol previously defined operational control as the ability to detect and interdict illegal activity. CBP, in their 2020 U.S. Border Patrol strategy, defined operational control as, quote, the ability to perceive and comprehend the operating environment, mobilize assets, infrastructure, and barriers to prevent criminal activity, and respond to and resolve any illicit cross-border incursions, close quote. Furthermore, in a May 2023 transcribed interview, Chief Patrol Agent Aaron Heitke of the San Diego sector affirmed that, quote, Border Patrol has operated under different definitions of operational control than what is listed in the Secure Fence Act. So, can you describe what happened in that exchange last year?
Ranking Member Nadler, the Congressman did not allow me to complete my answer. The Secure Fence Act, specifically the statute, defines operational control as not having one individual cross the border illegally. Under that statutory definition, no administration has achieved operational control. Last year, we had approximately 1.7 million different individuals cross the border, the southwest border. And so under that definition, no administration, under the Secure Fence Act, no administration has achieved operational control, and we have provided data with respect to the number of encounters experienced at the southwest border every month to Congress.
Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, questioned by Congressman Gerald Nadler of New York, ranking Democrat on the Judiciary Committee at today's committee hearing. You can find the full hearing and everything you hear on Washington Today in its entirety at our website, cspan.org. More from the CNN article. On Tuesday, a federal judge blocked President Biden's controversial asylum policy, delivering a major blow to the administration, which has leaned on the measure to drive down border crossings. The judge put the ruling on hold for 14 days for a possible appeal. There was another House hearing today focusing on immigration policy before the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, with testimony from the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Javier Becerra, talking about what happens when unaccompanied migrant children show up at the U.S.-Mexico border. An NBC News article from June reads that the Biden administration released 344 unaccompanied migrant children to live with non-family sponsors hosting 3 or more unaccompanied kids, says a new Health and Human Services Department audit, raising questions among advocates who worry that some minors are being sponsored by strangers who could exploit them for child labor. Here's the House Subcommittee Chair, Morgan Griffith, Republican from Virginia, questioning Secretary Becerra.
When a familial relationship is claimed, do you all do any kind of a DNA test to establish a genetic link between the sponsor and the child? And I asked that question, and it became more poignant last night as I was watching Sound of Freedom, because the bad guy was bringing a child who'd been kidnapped across the border. The good guys were there to intercept, but he presented fake documents claiming to be the uncle of the child. So do you all do a DNA test? Because I just got to tell you, Mr. Secretary, my information indicates that you all only do a DNA test in about 23% of the cases, and that's usually looking for child predators of some sort, not familial relationship. Is that true?
Mr. Chairman, we go through a thorough vetting process for each and every sponsor. We make every effort to try to find the closest relative for that child. And one of the tools that we use is DNA testing, voluntary DNA testing.
But you don't do that in every case where a familial relationship is claimed. Isn't that true?
Well, we make sure we verify the identity of the person. So, for example, we will use birth certificates. We will use other documentation that proves who the individual is.
But a birth certificate coming from another country, just like the passports presented in the film last night, may be forged. You would agree that documents can be forged, and that's not necessarily reliable. Man, I just got to tell you, I'm a member of Ancestry.com, and I have their DNA test. They can tell me about fourth cousins that I never knew existed on my father's side. There's a way to do this, and if we're truly going to properly vet before we place these children, we need to be doing more DNA testing. Let me move on.
And that's why we use DNA testing where it can help.
Well, occasionally. I'd like to go over the sponsor vetting process in more detail. I checked this morning, and field guidances 10 and 11 are still in effect. OR continues to waive background checks for people claiming to be distant family members and for other adults who live in the house where the child is being placed. With that as a background, I would have to ask that OR only completed fingerprint checks in 23% of cases. What percentage of sponsors now have completed fingerprint checks before you place a child with them?
And Mr. Chairman, we place the care and well-being of every unaccompanied child as our highest priority. And that's why I need to clarify what you and others have said, because you've misunderstood Field Guidance 10 and 11. You applied it to every child, and it does not apply to every child, those two guidances. Field Guidance 10 applies to only to children who are either eligible to be assigned to a parent, a legal guardian, or
or somebody who purports to be a close family relative. We've already been there. Right. Okay, let me ask you this.
And that we have to document and prove before we release that child.
You have documents, but they might be forged. All right.
We do everything to make sure that no one gets through the process.
Yes, sir.
By providing fraud. In fact, I just had a conversation with case managers about a very case where someone tried to present fraudulent information.
Secretary of Health and Human Services Javier Becerra, questioned by Congressman Morgan Griffith, Republican from Virginia, chair of the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations. Story from Reuters, presidential guards were holding Niger President Mohamed Bazoum inside his palace in the capital, Niamey, on Wednesday in what neighboring countries condemned as an attempted coup, with the United Nations, United States, and European Union denouncing any attempt to seize power. At the White House, some questions about this to John Kirby, a spokesperson for the National Security Council.
Can we ask about the situation in Niger very quickly right now? Did the Nigerian military storm the presidential palace there to free the president, President Bazoum, from his security services who are holding him, sir?
Well, look, we have watched this with deep concern, Peter. We certainly condemn any effort to detain or to subvert the functioning of Niger's democratically elected government. And we're still gathering facts here. And that government, as you know, is led by President Bazoum. We specifically urged the elements of the Presidential Guard to release him from detention and to refrain from any violence. We certainly welcome the strong statements and steps taken by the economic community of West African states and the African Union to defend Niger's democracy. And obviously, we're closely monitoring the situation. But it's all unfolding right now. And we're just going to have to stay tuned to it.
The message to Americans that are on the ground there, and how many U.S. citizens outside of the military members do you believe are in Niger?
I don't have an estimate of how many Americans are in Niger or military members, but obviously this is a very tense situation. We would advise all Americans in Niger to be careful about where they are and what they're doing. We just don't know enough about what's going on, so this is a time to put safety first.
Preliminary discussions about evacuations or anything like that?
Nothing like that right now, Peter. It's all just unfolding. We're just watching this very, very closely. We'll have to see how it unfolds.
Question to John Kirby, Strategic Communications Coordinator for the White House National Security Council at the White House briefing today. Back to the Reuters story on this. They write a military takeover in the former French colony could further complicate Western efforts to help countries in the Sahel region fight a jihadist insurgency that has spread from Mali over the past decade. Landlocked Niger has become a pivotal ally for Western powers seeking to help fight the insurgency, but facing growing acrimony from the new juntas in charge in Mali and Burkina Faso. It's also a key ally of the European Union in the fight against irregular migration from sub-Saharan Africa. That from Reuters. And thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word to get the stories Washington is talking about emailed to you every day. Subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.